Something confusing happens. In many relationships with avoidance, everything feels normal, sometimes even beautiful. The connection deepens. Conversations become more open. The distance fades. You begin feeling closer, safer, more emotionally connected. And then, something shifts. Not gradually, almost instantly. The avoidant goes cold. Replies slow down. Energy changes. Warmth disappears. The person who just opened up now feels distant again. And the most confusing part is this. Nothing bad happened. No fight. No betrayal. No obvious trigger. Just closeness. Because the moment intimacy crosses a certain line, the avoidant nervous system pulls the brake. Not because they don't care, but because something inside them just became overwhelming. And once you understand where that invisible line exists, their behavior suddenly starts making sense. At the beginning, avoidant relationships often feel surprisingly easy. Conversations flow. The connection builds naturally. There is curiosity, interest, even vulnerability, because early closeness does not threaten the avoidant nervous system. Not yet. At this stage, the relationship still feels light, flexible, open. Nothing feels demanded. Nothing feels expected. And the avoidant can move freely. Within that emotional space, they can share stories, laugh, open small parts of themselves, even express affection. But something important is quietly happening underneath. A threshold is forming, an invisible line between comfortable connection and emotional overload. Most people never see that line because avoidants themselves often don't see it either, but their nervous system feels it. And once the connection moves closer to that threshold, small changes begin appearing. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts. They take longer to reply. They become slightly quieter. They pull back from deeper conversations, not because they suddenly lost interest, because their nervous system is beginning to regulate distance. Avoidants regulate emotions through space. When closeness increases, their system looks for balance. More closeness means less autonomy. Less autonomy creates internal tension, and tension activates protection. But at this stage, most partners interpret the shift incorrectly. They assume something went wrong. Maybe they said too much. Maybe they revealed too much emotion. Maybe the avoidant is losing interest. So they do something natural. They move closer. More reassurance. More emotional expression. More attempts to restore the warmth. But here is the paradox. Few people understand. The more emotional gravity enters the relationship, the closer the dynamic moves to the avoidance threshold. And that threshold is not about love. It is about autonomy. Avoidants are not wired to fear connection. They are wired to fear engulfment, the feeling that closeness might swallow their independence, their emotional space, their sense of self. This fear rarely appears consciously. Most avoidants do not sit there thinking, I'm afraid of losing autonomy. Instead, they feel something vaguer, restlessness, pressure, the sense that something is becoming too intense, too emotionally demanding. And when the nervous system detects that pressure, it does what it learned to do very early in life: create distance, not aggressively, not intentionally, automatically. They become quieter, more distracted, less emotionally present. And to the partner, this feels sudden, cold, confusing, because the connection just seemed to deepen. But that deepening is exactly what triggered the response. Closeness crossed the invisible threshold. And once that happens, the avoidant nervous system begins restoring balance. Distance restores autonomy. Space restores regulation. Silence restores control. None of this means the feelings disappeared. None of it means the connection was fake. It simply means the nervous system reached its tolerance limit, and that limit is often much lower than people expect, especially when the relationship begins feeling emotionally real. Because emotional reality changes everything. For the avoidant system, casual connection is easy, light intimacy is manageable, but emotional dependence feels dangerous, not because the partner is dangerous, but because dependence means vulnerability, and vulnerability means losing control over emotional stability. So the moment closeness starts creating that feeling, the internal brakes activate. Distance, withdrawal, cooling of energy, not to punish the partner, not to manipulate the dynamic, but to restore emotional breathing room. And this is why avoidant relationships often feel like a cycle: warmth, connection, closeness, then sudden distance, then warmth again. Once space returns, because once the nervous system regains autonomy, the avoidant can approach again. They can reconnect, engage, laugh, even open up, until the threshold is crossed again and the brakes return. Understanding this threshold changes the entire way you see the dynamic. Because the avoidant did not go cold randomly, their nervous system simply hit its limit, the point where closeness started feeling like pressure, and pressure is the one signal. Avoidant systems are wired to escape. When intimacy crosses the avoidant threshold, the shift does not begin in their thoughts. It begins in the body, inside the nervous system, because attachment patterns are not only psychological, they are biological. Years of emotional conditioning shape how the body responds to closeness, to vulnerability, to dependence, and for many avoidants. Deep intimacy activates a quiet alarm, not a loud panic, not visible fear, something subtler, a sense of internal tightening. Emotional pressure begins to build. The mind starts searching for distance, not because something is wrong, because the system is trying to regulate itself. Closeness feels good at first: warmth, connection, shared attention. But when intimacy grows past a certain point, another layer activates: responsibility, expectation, emotional exposure. Now the connection is no longer casual. Now it matters. And when something matters, losing it becomes possible. Being needed becomes possible. Being dependent on becomes possible. For many avoidants, this creates tension because deep down, their nervous system learned something very specific. Emotional dependence is risky, not necessarily dangerous, but destabilizing. It creates situations where their emotional state is tied to another person, where expectations appear, where closeness might demand consistent presence, and consistency can feel like pressure. So the nervous system begins protecting itself, not through conflict, through cooling. Energy changes, tone changes, attention shifts. They become quieter, less emotionally expressive, less engaged in deep conversation. And this change often feels sudden to the partner, but internally, the shift has been building for a while. Each deeper conversation, each vulnerable moment, each increase in emotional closeness, all of it moved the relationship closer to the threshold until the system finally needed space. Because avoidants regulate through distance. Distance slows the emotional intensity. Distance restores independence. Distance reduces pressure. When they step back, their nervous system begins settling again. Breathing becomes easier. Thoughts become clearer. The emotional weight of the relationship decreases. And slowly, their system returns to baseline. But here is where most misunderstandings begin. The partner experiences the cooling as rejection. They feel hurt, confused, sometimes even betrayed, because the closeness felt real. And suddenly, it disappeared. So they do something natural. They try to restore the warmth. They ask questions. They seek reassurance. They express their emotions more directly. But that response often pushes the dynamic even closer to the threshold because emotional pursuit increases pressure, not intentionally, but energetically. The avoidant now senses that the relationship requires something from them: explanation, reassurance, emotional availability. And the more that pressure grows, the stronger their distance response becomes. Replies slow down. Communication becomes minimal. Sometimes silence appears, not because they want to punish the partner, but because their nervous system is protecting autonomy. Autonomy is the core regulator for avoidant attachment. It is how they maintain emotional stability. So when closeness begins, threatening that autonomy, their system pulls back, even if part of them still cares deeply, even if part of them still wants connection. Because this is the central conflict. Inside avoidant attachment, they want connection, but they fear losing themselves. Inside it, they want closeness, but not at the cost of emotional independence. So the nervous system tries to balance both. Move closer, step back, approach again, then distance again. A rhythm forms, one that can feel exhausting for both people. But once you understand what is actually happening inside the avoidance system, the pattern becomes clearer. The coldness was not random. The distance was not mysterious. It was regulation, a nervous system trying to manage intimacy without losing autonomy. And that invisible struggle is what creates the sudden shift so many people experience. The moment closeness crosses the line their system can tolerate. That moment when warmth turns quiet and the emotional break quietly activates. Most people think the avoidant goes cold because something changed about you, something you said, something you did, something you revealed. But most of the time, nothing about you changed. What changed was the level of intimacy. The relationship moved deeper, closer, more emotionally real. And that is the moment the avoidant nervous system starts recalculating, not consciously, instinctively, because deeper intimacy changes the emotional landscape. At first, the connection feels light, curious, playful, open. There are no expectations yet, no emotional obligations, just discovery. But when closeness grows, the meaning of the relationship begins to shift. Now the connection is no longer casual. Now it carries weight, emotional weight, future weight, responsibility. And responsibility is where the avoidance system becomes cautious, because responsibility creates expectation. Expectation creates pressure, and pressure threatens autonomy. This is the moment many avoidants start feeling something difficult to explain: a subtle loss of freedom, not real freedom, perceived freedom, the feeling that the relationship is beginning to define them, to require them, to depend on them, even if the partner never asked for that, even if nothing explicit was said. The nervous system detects the shift anyway. Closeness begins feeling heavier, more emotionally loaded, more important, and importance creates vulnerability. Because if something matters, losing it can hurt. Disappointing someone can hurt. Failing someone can hurt. And many avoidants have learned something early in life. Emotional expectations are difficult to meet, so the nervous system tries to prevent the situation before it grows too large. Distance appears, energy cools, communication slows, not to destroy the connection, to reduce its intensity, because intensity is what triggers the avoidant threshold. And when that threshold appears, the system moves toward balance. Balance through space, balance through independence, balance through emotional quiet. But from the outside, this looks very different. The partner sees warmth disappear. They see closeness replaced by distance, and the mind searches for explanations. Maybe they lost interest. Maybe they changed their mind. Maybe the connection was never real. But often, none of those things are true. The avoidant did feel the connection. They did enjoy the closeness. They did value the bond. The problem was not the connection. The problem was the intensity that came with it. Because intensity activates two competing forces inside avoidant attachment: the desire for connection and the fear of losing autonomy. Those forces pull in opposite directions. One part wants closeness, another part wants distance. And when intimacy becomes strong, the distance side often wins first, not permanently, just temporarily, enough to restore equilibrium, enough to quiet the nervous system. Once space returns, something interesting happens. The avoidant begins feeling safer again. Their breathing slows, their thoughts clear, the emotional weight of the relationship softens, and suddenly, the connection becomes approachable again. They may reach out, start a conversation, reconnect with warmth, sometimes even act as if nothing changed. And this confuses the partner even more because the cycle seems unpredictable: warm, cold, close, distant, connected, unavailable. But underneath the confusion, the pattern remains consistent. Closeness rises, threshold activates, distance restores balance, closeness returns, until the threshold appears again. Understanding this cycle changes the entire interpretation. The avoidant was not playing emotional games. They were regulating their nervous system, trying to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed, trying to experience closeness without losing autonomy. And that invisible negotiation is what creates the sudden coldness people experience the moment intimacy moves beyond what their system can comfortably hold. Once you understand the intimacy threshold, the pattern stops feeling random. You begin seeing the invisible moment where the shift happens. Closeness increases, the connection deepens, emotional reality appears, and somewhere inside the avoidant nervous system, a quiet calculation begins. How close is too close? How much intimacy can I hold before I lose my autonomy? Most avoidants never ask this question consciously, but their nervous system answers it automatically. When closeness feels safe, they move forward. When closeness feels heavy, they pull back, not to hurt you, not to confuse you, but to restore their internal balance. And once you see this clearly, something important changes in how you interpret the dynamic. You stop chasing explanations inside every cold moment. You stop blaming yourself for every shift in energy. You stop believing that closeness disappearing means the connection was fake. Instead, you begin recognizing the pattern beneath the behavior: a nervous system trying to manage intimacy, trying to stay connected without feeling consumed, trying to experience closeness without losing independence, and that internal struggle creates the sudden coldness so many people experience. The moment intimacy moves past the limit their system can tolerate. But here is the deeper truth most people eventually discover. Understanding the pattern does not mean you must accept the cycle, because awareness changes your position inside the dynamic. When you stop reacting to every shift, the emotional gravity changes. When you stop chasing warmth that disappeared, the dynamic stabilizes. When your emotional center returns to your own life, the relationship stops controlling your internal state. And that shift is where clarity appears. Not clarity about them, clarity about yourself, your needs, your emotional boundaries, your tolerance for distance. Because relationships cannot survive on understanding alone, they require alignment. Two nervous systems that can move toward intimacy without constantly pulling away. And when that alignment exists, closeness does not trigger panic. Connection does not require escape. Intimacy does not activate the emotional brake. It simply deepens, calmly, naturally, without cycles of warmth and cold. That is the difference between understanding a pattern and finding a relationship that does not depend on it. If this video helped you finally understand why avoidants suddenly go cold after getting close, then you are already seeing relationship dynamics through a deeper psychological lens. And that is exactly what we explore here on the Inner Odyssey, the hidden nervous system patterns behind attachment, the emotional mechanisms that shape human behavior, and the quiet psychological shifts that change how people respond to you. So if you want to understand avoidant attachment, relationship psychology, and the deeper forces behind emotional connection, make sure you subscribe to the Inner Odyssey, because once you understand the psychology beneath the surface, you stop reacting to confusing behavior and you start moving through relationships with clarity,